That night started like so many others, quiet in a way that felt heavier than silence. My husband had left earlier than planned, a rushed kiss on my cheek and a promise he'd call before bed. The house felt too big after the door closed, every room echoing with things we never said to each other anymore. We had been married long enough for routine to replace curiosity, long enough for distance to disguise itself as comfort. I told myself I was fine being alone, that the knot in my chest was just tiredness, not loneliness. When the doorbell rang, I wasn't expecting anyone. I hesitated before opening it, already annoyed at the interruption. Standing there was his best friend, someone I had known almost as long as my husband. He held a small, awkward smile, the kind that didn't fully reach his eyes. He said my husband had asked him to drop off some documents he'd forgotten, nothing important, just something work-related. I let him in without thinking twice. It felt normal, harmless, familiar. We sat in the living room, keeping polite distance between us. He talked about traffic, about how my husband had been stressed lately. I nodded, listening but not fully present. There was something different in the air, something I couldn't name. Maybe it was the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, or the way he seemed to choose his words carefully, like he was afraid of saying too much. I noticed things I hadn't before, how calm his voice was, how he didn't rush to fill every pause that I offered him a drink, mostly to give myself something to do. In the kitchen, I felt my hands trembling as I poured water into 2 glasses. I told myself it was ridiculous, that this was just a friend of my husband, someone safe. But my thoughts kept drifting to how invisible I'd felt lately, how conversations at home had become short and practical, how no one had really asked how I was in a long time. When I returned, he was standing near the window, looking out into the dark. He turned when he heard me, and for a moment our eyes met longer than they should have. Neither of us looked away right away. It wasn't dramatic, just a quiet pause, but it felt charged. I handed him the glass, our fingers brushing briefly, sending a spark through me that caught me off guard. We talked about small things at first, memories from years ago, moments we'd both shared with my husband. Then the conversation shifted without either of us pushing it. He mentioned how strong I'd been during a difficult time in our marriage, how he'd always admired that. The words hit me harder than I expected. Admired. No one had used that word for me in a long time. I laughed it off, but inside something softened. The silence returned, different now, not awkward but full. I became painfully aware that we were alone, truly alone, with no one to interrupt us. I should have changed the subject, should have found a reason to end the visit. Instead, I stayed where I was, feeling seen in a way that scared me. I realized then that the danger wasn't in him being there, but in how much I wanted someone to notice me, to understand the parts of me I'd been hiding even from myself. That was the moment the line first appeared in my mind. Faint but unmistakable. I hadn't crossed it, not yet. But I knew, sitting there with my husband's best friend in the quiet of our home, that I was closer to it than I had ever been before. I tried to pull myself back, to remind myself that this was just a visit, nothing more. But once a thought enters your mind, it doesn't always leave when you ask it to. The conversation drifted into places it had never gone before, softer and more personal. He asked how I was really doing, not in the polite way people usually do, but like he genuinely wanted the answer. I hesitated, measuring my words, then surprised myself by being honest. I told him I felt tired all the time, not physically, but emotionally, like I was carrying something heavy no one could see. He listened without interrupting, without trying to fix anything. That alone felt dangerous. I wasn't used to being heard like that anymore. When I finished speaking, I expected him to brush it off or change the subject, but he didn't. He admitted he often felt like he existed in the background of other people's lives. Always dependable, rarely chosen. There was no self-pity in his voice, just quiet truth. In that moment, it felt like we were standing on the same side of something, looking at the same emptiness. We sat closer without deciding to. The space between us seemed to shrink on its own, like it had always been meant to disappear. I could feel his presence beside me, steady and warm. My heart was beating faster than it should have, and I hated how aware I was of it. Every part of me knew this was wrong, yet another part whispered that talking wasn't a crime, that honesty couldn't hurt anyone. The silence returned again, heavier this time. It pressed on my chest until I felt like I had to say something or break. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the hesitation in his eyes, the same conflict I felt inside myself. That's when the thought became words. I didn't say anything reckless or obvious. I framed it carefully, almost cautiously, as if that could make it harmless. I said that sometimes feelings show up when you don't invite them, and pretending they aren't there doesn't make them go away. The moment the words left my mouth, I wished I could pull them back. His expression changed instantly. He sat up straighter, like he'd been startled awake. He reminded me of my husband, of their friendship, of the line that shouldn't be crossed. His voice wasn't angry, just firm, and somehow that made it worse. I nodded quickly, agreeing, telling him I knew that, telling him I wasn't suggesting anything inappropriate. Even as I said it, I knew that wasn't entirely true to him. My hands were clasped tightly in my lap, my nails digging into my skin. I felt exposed, like I'd revealed too much of myself. I apologized, saying I was just tired and talking nonsense. He didn't stand up or move away. Instead, he softened, his voice dropping as he said he understood what I meant more than I realized. He said feelings didn't automatically mean action, and that acknowledging them didn't make us bad people. Hearing that felt like permission. Even if he hadn't meant it that way. We were both quiet after that, suspended in a moment neither of us seemed able to end. I knew this was the point where I should have insisted he leave, where I should have reasserted boundaries. But something held me back, something selfish and aching. I realized that my suggestion hadn't been about him at all. It had been about wanting to feel alive, wanted, and understood, even if just for a moment. When he finally spoke again, he didn't say yes and he didn't say no. He just said that some lines are easy to see until you're standing right in front of them. The way he looked at me told me he was standing there too. And in that quiet understanding, I knew that whatever happened next, things were already different. After he said that, neither of us moved. It wasn't the kind of moment you see in movies, dramatic or obvious. It was quieter, more unsettling. The air felt thick, like every breath carried weight. I could hear my own heartbeat, slow and loud in my ears. I told myself that nothing had happened yet, that words were just words, but I also knew that something irreversible had already shifted between us. He finally broke the silence by saying this couldn't go anywhere. Not because he didn't feel something, but because feeling something didn't give us the right to act on it. I nodded again, too quickly, agreeing with everything he said while silently clinging to the fact that he hadn't denied the feeling itself. That contradiction sat heavy in my chest. We were both trying to be responsible while standing far too close to irresponsibility. What crossed the line wasn't a touch or a kiss. It was honesty without filters. I admitted things I had never said out loud before, not even to myself. I told him how lonely I felt lying next to someone who no longer really saw me, how I missed being more than just someone's wife. Saying it out loud felt like a release, and I hated how good that release felt. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge. He just listened, and in doing so, became part of something he never should have been invited into. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, rougher. He said he'd felt the same kind of loneliness for a long time, that he'd learned to ignore it because it was easier than confronting it. Hearing that made me feel less alone, and that was the problem. We were finding comfort in each other that should have belonged elsewhere. I could feel the boundary dissolving, not in one dramatic moment, but slowly, like something worn down by repetition. There was a moment where our knees brushed as we shifted, accidental but not unnoticeable. Neither of us pulled away immediately. That hesitation was the crossing. The awareness that we both felt it and chose for just a second too long not to correct it. Guilt washed over me almost instantly, sharp and unforgiving. I stood up abruptly, needing distance, needing air, needing to remind myself who I was supposed to be. He took that as his cue to leave. The goodbye was awkward and rushed, full of things unsaid. When the door closed behind him, the house felt unbearably quiet. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door like it might open again, like I could somehow rewind the last hour. My phone buzzed with a message from my husband asking how my evening was going. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering, unsure how to answer something so simple when everything inside me felt so complicated. That night I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the conversation, analyzing every word, every pause. I told myself I hadn't betrayed anyone because nothing physical had happened. But deep down, I knew that wasn't entirely true. I had shared parts of myself that no longer belonged to just me. I had allowed someone else into a space that should have been protected. The days that followed were worse. I avoided his name, his face, any reminder of him. When my husband mentioned him casually, my stomach tightened. I became hyper-aware of my own behavior, afraid that guilt was written all over my face. At the same time, I felt a strange sense of loss, like something meaningful had been taken away before it even had a chance to exist. Then my husband told me he'd be coming home earlier than expected. My heart dropped. Relief and panic collided inside me. I wondered if he would notice the change in me, if he would sense the secret I was carrying. As I prepared for his return, I realized that nothing in my life looked different on the outside. But inside, I was no longer the same person who had answered the door that night, believing she was completely safe. When my husband walked through the door, everything looked the same as it always had. He smiled, set his bag down, and asked if I'd missed him. I said yes without hesitation because it was true, and because the word carried more weight now than it used to. As he talked about his trip, I watched him closely, searching his face for any sign that he knew something had changed. There was nothing. His trust sat between us like something solid and unbroken, and that made my chest ache more than suspicion ever could have. But I moved through the next few days carefully, measuring every word and reaction. Guilt followed me everywhere, quiet but constant. Simple things felt heavier than before. When my husband laughed, I felt undeserving of the sound. When he reached for my hand, I wondered if he could feel the tension in mine. I told myself I would bury what happened, that I would treat it as a moment of weakness that didn't deserve any more attention. But secrets don't disappear just because you ignore them. His best friend kept his distance after that. There were no messages, no casual check-ins, no excuses to come by. When we did cross paths in group settings, everything stayed polite and surface level. We avoided eye contact more than necessary, both of us silently agreeing to protect what we had nearly damaged. To anyone watching, nothing seemed wrong. To me, every interaction felt loaded with unspoken understanding. What surprised me most was how the desire faded, replaced by something heavier and more enduring. It wasn't longing anymore, but awareness. I became painfully aware of my own capacity to cross lines I once thought were unmovable. I realized that loneliness doesn't announce itself loudly. It slips in quietly, convincing you that being seen for a moment is worth the risk of everything else. I never told my husband what happened. Not because I didn't respect him, but because I understood that confession wouldn't have been about honesty. It would have been about easing my own guilt at the cost of his peace. I chose instead to face what I'd learned about myself. I started paying attention to the distance in my marriage, not to blame him, but to understand where I had gone wrong in staying silent for so long. That night didn't end my marriage, and it didn't start an affair. But it changed me in a way that was impossible to undo. I became more cautious with my thoughts, more honest about my needs, and more aware of how easily boundaries can blur when you feel invisible. I learned that not all betrayals leave evidence behind. Some live quietly inside you, shaping the way you see yourself and the choices you make afterward. Even now, I think about how close I came to a version of my life that would have hurt a lot of people, including myself. I don't tell this story to justify what I felt or what I said. I tell it because sometimes the most dangerous moments aren't the ones where everything falls apart, but the ones where nothing does. Where you walk away appearing unchanged, carrying a secret that reminds you every day how fragile trust really is.